The flames could be seen from 3 blocks away that September night in 1847. Orange tongues licking at the Charleston sky as the grandest townhouse on Broad Street collapsed into ash and memory. Inside that inferno burned something far more valuable than mahogany furniture or crystal chandeliers. Something that would change the course of dozens of lives. Every record of human ownership, every bill of sale, every ledger entry documenting the buying and selling of souls, turned to smoke and drifted over the harbor. The man who set that fire walked into the fog with nothing but the clothes on his back and vengeance in his heart. And what the slave catchers found at dawn would become legend whispered in quarters and kitchens for generations. But this story doesn't begin with fire. It begins that morning, on the auction block, where Ezekiel watched his entire world ripped apart in front of 200 silent witnesses. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The auction house on Chalmers Street had been standing for 63 years when Ezekiel was marched through its doors. That Tuesday morning in September, his wrists were bound with rope that had worn grooves into his skin during the night he'd spent in the holding pen, and his bare feet scraped against cobblestones still cool from the harbor breeze. Behind him walked his wife Ruth and their daughter Miriam, and though he could not turn to look at them without earning a blow from the guard's stick, he could hear Ruth's breathing, quick and shallow, the kind of breathing that came before tears she would not allow herself to shed in front of these people. They had been the property of Colonel James Whitmore for 12 years, working his rice plantation 30 miles up the Ashley River, where the land turned to marsh and the mosquitoes bred thick as storm clouds. Ezekiel had been a carpenter, valued for his skill with joinery and his ability to read the grain of wood like other men read books. Ruth worked in the big house, her hands expert at the delicate work of lace-making that fetched high prices in the Charleston shops. Miriam, only 8 years old, had just begun learning her mother's trade, her small fingers already showing the dexterity that would have made her valuable in a few more years. But Colonel Whitmore had died 3 weeks ago, clutching his chest during Sunday dinner, and his wastrel son Richard had inherited an estate drowning in gambling debts that demanded immediate payment. The auction house interior smelled of sweat and tobacco and something else Ezekiel could not name, something like fear made solid and hung in the air where it could coat the lungs. Morning light streamed through high windows, illuminating dust motes that danced above the platform where human beings would be displayed like livestock. The auctioneer was a man named Calloway, Nathaniel Calloway, whose reputation extended throughout the Carolinas for the prices he could command and the efficiency with which he processed sales. He was a thin man with a pointed face and wire-rimmed spectacles that caught the light when he moved his head, and he consulted a leather-bound ledger as the morning's merchandise was arranged according to his specifications. Ezekiel stood in the holding area with 19 other people from the Whitmore plantation, all of them silent except for the occasional sob from someone's child or the shuffle of feet against wooden floors. He had learned over 12 years that there were different kinds of silence. There was the silence of exhaustion after 16 hours in the rice fields, and the silence of prayer in the small chapel they'd built from scrap lumber behind the quarters, and the silence of a mother holding a sick child through the night. This was a different silence altogether, the silence of people who had just realized that every fragile thing they'd managed to build in their bondage was about to be scattered like chaff in the wind. Ruth stood close enough that Ezekiel could feel the warmth of her body, though they did not touch. She had been 18 when Colonel Whitmore purchased her from a state sale in Georgetown, brought her upriver to work in his household, and within a year had allowed her to marry Ezekiel in a ceremony that had no legal standing but meant everything to them anyway. They had spoken vows under a oak tree with Spanish moss hanging like wedding veils, and old Moses, who led their prayer meetings, had blessed their union with words from Corinthians about love bearing all things and enduring all things. Miriam had come 10 months later, born in the small cabin they shared, and for 8 years they had maintained the illusion that they were a family in any way that mattered. The first lot brought to the platform was a field hand named Joshua, a powerful man in his 20s whose muscles had been built by years of digging irrigation ditches in the plantation's lower fields. Calloway described him in a voice that carried to every corner of the room, detailing his age, his health, his work capacity, his teeth, which Calloway examined by forcing Joshua's mouth open like he was inspecting a horse. The bidding began at $400 and climbed quickly. Plantation owners and their agents calling out numbers with casual waves of their hands or slight nods of their heads. Joshua sold for $730 to a man from Edisto Island who needed laborers for his cotton operation. And just like that, a life was transferred from one ledger to another. Ezekiel watched as person after person was brought forward, described, inspected, and sold. He watched families separated without ceremony or apology, watched a mother sold to a buyer from Savannah while her 3 children went to different plantations scattered across the low country. He watched the auctioneer's clerk record every transaction in precise handwriting, noting names and prices and new owners with the same care a shopkeeper might use when tallying the day's sales of flour and sugar. The ledger sat on a small table beside the platform, its pages filling with the mathematics of human commerce. When they called Ruth's name, Ezekiel felt something crack inside his chest, some piece of himself that had been holding firm, suddenly giving way like a dam that could no longer hold back the flood. They led her to the platform, and she walked with her head high, her dignity intact, despite everything. Despite the hands that positioned her for display and the eyes that examined her like she was merchandise. Calloway spoke about her skills with needle and thread, about her literacy, which made her valuable for household management, about her age, which meant she had productive years ahead. He mentioned almost as an afterthought that she had borne 1 child and appeared capable of bearing more, a detail that made several buyers lean forward with renewed interest. The bidding started at $300. A plantation owner from the PD region offered $350. A merchant's wife who needed a housekeeper bid $400. The price climbed in steady increments, while Ruth stood motionless on the platform, her eyes fixed on some point above the crowd, where perhaps she could imagine herself anywhere but here. At $620, a new voice entered the bidding, a woman named Victoria Ashford who owned a dress shop on King Street and needed skilled workers who could handle the intricate embroidery her wealthy clients demanded. Mrs. Ashford bid with calm certainty, raising the price in $20 increments until the other buyers fell away and the auctioneer's gavel came down at $740. Ezekiel tried to catch Ruth's eyes as they led her from the platform, but she would not look at him, and he understood that she was protecting herself, the only way she knew how, by not allowing herself to feel anything that might break her before this day was finished. They took her to a separate holding area where she would wait with the other sold slaves until their new owners collected them, and Ezekiel stood there with Miriam's small hand gripping his trouser leg and felt the world tilt sideways. Miriam was next. They called her to the platform, and she looked up at Ezekiel with eyes that expected him to stop this. to do something, anything, because fathers were supposed to protect their children, and she was only 8 years old and did not understand why no protection was coming. Ezekiel knelt down despite the guard's warning shout, and he held his daughter's face in his hands for 3 seconds that he would remember for the rest of his life, memorizing the exact curve of her cheek and the small scar above her left eyebrow where she'd fallen from a fence post 2 years ago. And then the guard yanked him back and dragged Miriam toward the platform. Calloway's voice seemed to come from very far away as he described the child. She was young but trainable, he said, with good eyesight and nimble fingers ideal for close work. A family from Colombia purchased her for $290, planning to train her as a lady's maid for their teenage daughter. The transaction took less than 5 minutes from start to finish. Miriam cried when they took her away. The first sound Ezekiel had heard from her all morning, and that cry would echo in his ears for months afterward, a sound that would wake him in the night and follow him through his days, like a ghost he could neither escape nor exorcise. When they brought Ezekiel to the platform, he moved like a man walking underwater, his limbs heavy and his thoughts scattered. Calloway examined him with professional detachment, noting his carpenter's skills, his literacy, his relatively good health, despite the scars on his back from a whipping he'd received 5 years ago for being caught with a book. The auctioneer made these scars sound like badges of honor, evidence that Ezekiel could withstand discipline, that he was broken to obedience. The bidding reached $900 before a shipbuilder named Carson from the North Charleston shipyards made a final offer of $975 that no one matched. In the space of 90 minutes, Ezekiel's family had been dismantled and sold to 3 different owners in 3 different directions. Ruth would work in a dress shop in the city. Miriam would be taken 2 hours inland to serve in a household where she would grow up among strangers. Ezekiel would spend his days building ships in a yard that smelled of tar and sawdust and salt water. The combined price for the 3 of them was $1,905, a sum that Calloway's clerk recorded in the ledger with a neat hand before moving on to the next entry. Ezekiel stood in the holding area afterward, waiting to be collected by his new owner, and he could see through a gap in the wall where Ruth sat in her separate pen. She was crying now, her shoulders shaking with sobs. She'd held back all morning, and he wanted to go to her, but there were guards between them and iron bars and the whole weight of a legal system built to keep people like them exactly where they were. He pressed his face against the gap in the wall and he whispered her name, though she could not possibly hear him, and he made a promise to himself that he did not yet know how he would keep. Carson collected him at noon, loading Ezekiel into a wagon with 3 other newly purchased slaves, all of them bound for the shipyards where they would work 12-hour days, building the merchant vessels that carried cotton and rice to northern ports. The wagon rolled through Charleston streets, and Ezekiel watched the city pass by. The fine houses with their piazzas facing the harbor breeze, the churches with their tall steeples, the market where free people bought and sold goods they actually owned. He had been in Charleston only twice before in his life, both times accompanying Colonel Whitmore on business, and he had never imagined he would return under these circumstances. The shipyards occupied 5 acres of waterfront property where the Cooper River met the harbor, a sprawling operation of dry docks and lumber yards and forge buildings that rang with the sound of hammers on metal. Carson owned the whole enterprise and took pride in his fleet, vessels known for their craftsmanship and speed. He was not a cruel man by the standards of the time, which meant he fed his workers adequately and did not whip them without what he considered good reason. But he was also not a man given to sentiment or second thoughts about the system that had made his fortune possible. Ezekiel was assigned to a work crew building a 3-masted schooner destined for the sugar trade, a beautiful ship that would carry sweetness produced by suffering to markets that did not want to think too hard about where their luxuries came from. He was given tools and materials and instructions, and he set to work because there was nothing else to do, his hands moving through familiar motions while his mind circled endlessly around the same questions. Where was Ruth sleeping tonight? Was Miriam crying for her parents? How could he possibly find them in a region where enslaved people had no legal right to travel? No money for bribes, no maps to follow even if they could escape. The sleeping quarters at the shipyard were better than the holding pen, but not by much. A long wooden building with bunks stacked 3 high and a single fireplace at one end that did little to cut the chill on cold nights. Ezekiel was given a bottom bunk and a blanket and a bowl for his rations, and he lay awake that first night listening to the snores and coughs of 24 other men, all of them carrying their own griefs and losses, all of them trapped in the same impossible situation. A man in the bunk above him introduced himself as Isaac, a blacksmith who had been working the shipyard forges for 6 years. Isaac had a wife somewhere in the city, sold away before he'd been purchased by Carson, and in the darkness he told Ezekiel that missing someone you loved was like carrying a stone in your chest that got heavier every day until you learned to make room for it. The trick, Isaac said, was not to let that stone crush everything else, not to let it destroy the small moments of joy or friendship or beauty that might still be possible even in bondage. Ezekiel listened and said nothing, because he did not believe yet that any joy was possible. But he remembered Isaac's words anyway. In the days that followed, Isaac became Ezekiel's guide to the rhythms and hierarchies of shipyard life. The forge where Isaac worked was the beating heart of the operation, a place where iron was heated and shaped into the countless fittings a ship required, from the massive anchors to the delicate hinges on cabin doors. Isaac worked with 2 other blacksmiths, one enslaved like himself, and one a free black man named Gabriel, who earned wages and lived in his own rented room above a bakery on East Bay Street. The proximity of enslaved and free workers created a strange tension that Ezekiel had never experienced on the plantation, where the boundaries between bondage and freedom had been absolute and uncomplicated. Gabriel would talk about his plans for the future while they worked, about the money he was saving to buy a small smithy of his own, about the woman he was courting who worked as a laundress and dreamed of opening a washing establishment that would serve the city's growing merchant class. Isaac would listen to these plans with an expression Ezekiel could not quite read, something between longing and resignation, and afterward he would work his forge with a particular intensity that suggested he was hammering out feelings that had no other outlet. Ezekiel understood that tension intimately, the experience of working beside someone whose life trajectory was fundamentally different from your own, not because of skill or character, but because of the arbitrary circumstances of birth and ownership. September turned to October, and the weather cooled, and Ezekiel worked on the schooner from dawn until dusk, his hands building something beautiful that would never belong to him. Carson was pleased with his work and said so, which meant Ezekiel's rations improved slightly, and he was trusted with more complex tasks. The other carpenters in his crew were a mix of enslaved and free black craftsmen who worked side by side. The free men earning wages they could save, while the enslaved men earned nothing but their continued survival. They taught Ezekiel the particular challenges of shipbuilding, the way you had to account for how wood would swell in water, the importance of caulking every seam until it was watertight, the art of shaping a hull that would cut through waves instead of fighting them. On Sunday afternoons, when there was no work, Ezekiel would walk down to the harbor and stand at the water's edge, looking out at the ships anchored in the roads and wondering which directions they would sail, north to Philadelphia or New York, where there were free black communities, places where a man might disappear into crowds of people who would not ask too many questions, south to the Caribbean islands, where slavery took different forms but was slavery nonetheless, east across the Atlantic to Africa, the homeland his grandparents had been stolen from, a place he knew only through stories told in the quarters late at night. He stood at the waterline and felt the pull of all those possible directions, while knowing he could take none of them. Not without Ruth, not without Miriam. The harbor itself was a world unto itself, a place where the logic of slavery became complicated by the demands of maritime commerce. Ships needed crews, and those crews included free black sailors who moved between ports with a liberty that enslaved people could only imagine. Ezekiel would watch these sailors come ashore, men who walked with a particular confidence that came from knowing they could leave Charleston whenever their ship sailed, men whose papers said they were free and whose skills made them valuable enough that captains overlooked the color of their skin in favor of their competence with rigging and navigation. Some of these sailors would nod to Ezekiel as they passed, a gesture of solidarity that acknowledged their shared ancestry, even if their circumstances were vastly different. It was during these harbor walks that Ezekiel began to understand the geography of possibility that existed around the edges of the slave system. There were places in the city where free black people congregated, neighborhoods near the docks, where questions about papers and ownership were asked less frequently because the daily business of commerce required a certain flexibility. There were churches where free and enslaved people worshiped together, creating networks of communication that moved information faster than any official channels. There were markets where enslaved people who hired out their own time could earn small amounts of money that their owners never saw, creating underground economies that functioned alongside the legal commerce of the city. It was on one of these Sunday walks that Ezekiel first heard about the Underground Railroad, whispered about by two men standing near the fish market, who did not realize he could hear them. They spoke of conductors and safe houses en routes north, of people who had made it to freedom in Pennsylvania and beyond. Ezekiel had heard such stories before and dismissed them as wishful thinking. But now he listened with every fiber of his attention, memorizing details even as he pretended to be examining the day's catch laid out on ice. That night he lay in his bunk and tried to imagine it, tried to picture himself finding Ruth and Miriam somehow, tried to see them moving through darkness toward some promised land where families could stay together and no one could be bought or sold. The obstacles seemed insurmountable. He did not know where Ruth worked beyond somewhere on King Street, did not know the family name of the people who had bought Miriam, had no money for bribes or travel, no forged papers that might let him pass as a free man. Even if he could solve all those problems, even if he could locate his family and plan an escape, where would they go that slave catchers would not follow? October became November, and Ezekiel began to pay attention to the rhythms of the city in ways he had not bothered with before. He learned which guards at the shipyard were lazy and which were vigilant, learned the times when the streets were most crowded and a black man might move through them with less scrutiny, learned the locations of the city's slave pens and auction houses, and the routes the patrols followed after dark. He did not yet have a plan, but he was gathering information the way a carpenter gathers tools, stockpiling resources for a project whose exact shape he could not yet see. It was Isaac who inadvertently gave Ezekiel the next piece of the puzzle. They were working together on a cold morning in late November, fitting oak ribs into the frame of another new ship, when Isaac mentioned that his wife had been purchased by a seamstress on King Street, a white woman who ran a dress shop and employed 3 enslaved women in the back room where they did embroidery work that sold for outrageous prices. Ezekiel's hands stilled on the wood he was holding, and he asked Isaac which shop, trying to keep his voice casual. And Isaac said it was the one near the corner of Queen Street, a place called Ashford's Fine Dressmaking. That Sunday, Ezekiel walked to King Street for the first time since arriving at the shipyard. The walk took nearly an hour, and he had to show his pass to 2 different patrols. A scrap of paper signed by Carson that gave him permission to be away from the shipyard for religious services, a common enough practice that the patrols barely glanced at it before waving him on. King Street was Charleston's main shopping district, lined with stores selling everything from boots to books to barrels of imported wine. Ashford's Fine Dressmaking occupied a narrow building with large windows displaying gowns that cost more than some families earned in a year. Ezekiel stood across the street and watched the shop for 20 minutes, studying its rhythms. Customers came and went through the front door while deliveries were made at a side entrance that led to what must be the workroom. He could not see into the back of the building from his position, but he imagined Ruth there, bent over embroidery in lamplight, her fingers creating beauty for women who would never know her name. The temptation to walk to that side door and call for her was nearly overwhelming, but he forced himself to turn away, because acting without a plan would accomplish nothing except getting them both punished, or worse. He returned to the shipyard and began to form the outline of something that was not yet quite a plan but was moving in that direction. He would need to find Miriam first, which meant somehow learning the name and location of the family in Columbia who had purchased her. Then he would need money. More money than he could imagine acquiring through any legal means. Then he would need escape routes, and timing, and luck, so much luck that the whole enterprise seemed doomed before it even started. But Ezekiel had learned something in 12 years of bondage, had learned that impossible things sometimes happened anyway if you were patient and watchful and willing to act when the moment presented itself. December brought cold rains that turned the shipyard into a sea of mud and made the work twice as hard. Ezekiel's hands cracked and bled from the constant wet and cold, but Carson pushed the crews harder because he had contracts to fulfill and ships to deliver. On the 15th of December, a Sunday, Ezekiel walked again to King Street, and this time he saw Ruth. She emerged from the side entrance of Ashford's with 2 other women, all of them carrying baskets of scraps and threads to be disposed of, and for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Ezekiel stood frozen on the opposite side of the street, while his wife walked not 30 feet away from him. She looked thinner than he remembered, her face drawn in a way that suggested she was not eating enough or sleeping well, or perhaps both. She wore a plain dress that was neat and clean, but showed signs of repeated mending, and her hands as she carried the basket showed the telltale marks of needle pricks that came from long hours of close work. She did not see him, or if she did, she gave no sign. And Ezekiel understood that approaching her here in daylight would risk everything for a few stolen moments that would change nothing about their situation. But seeing her, knowing she was alive and within reach, changed something in Ezekiel. The plan that had been forming in the back of his mind suddenly seemed less impossible, the obstacles less insurmountable. He began to think not just about escape, but about what would need to happen before escape became possible. What pieces would need to fall into place, what tools he would need to acquire. The tool he acquired first was information, gathered in fragments from a dozen different sources over the following weeks. He learned from a delivery driver that Mrs. Ashford kept her household accounts in a ledger in her shop's back office, recorded every purchase and sale in meticulous detail. He learned from one of the free black carpenters at the shipyard that the auction house kept copies of all bills of sale, filed by date and seller, available for inspection by buyers who wanted to verify their purchases. He learned from Isaac that the city required slaveholders to register their human property annually, creating records that were kept at the customs house and updated whenever ownership changed. All of these records, Ezekiel realized, lived in physical form somewhere in Charleston. Ledgers and files and registries that documented the machinery of slavery in ink and paper. And paper, as any carpenter knew, was the most flammable material there was. The idea came to him on a January night when he was lying in his bunk, listening to sleet rattle against the roof of the sleeping quarters. If the records did not exist, if the carefully maintained documentation of ownership was destroyed, what would happen? People would still be enslaved. Certainly, the destruction of paperwork would not magic away the reality of bondage, but specific claims of ownership would become harder to prove. Families separated might claim they belonged together. People sold might claim they had been sold to different buyers, or not sold at all. In the chaos that followed a records disaster, some people might slip through the cracks, might disappear into the confusion, and emerge somewhere else under different names. It was a mad idea, the kind of thing that would get a man killed if he was caught even planning it. But Ezekiel turned it over in his mind, like a carpenter examining a piece of wood for flaws, looking at it from every angle, considering its feasibility. The auction house where he and Ruth and Miriam had been sold was Nathaniel Calloway's establishment, and Calloway was known to keep meticulous records going back decades. Every slave he had sold, every price paid, every buyer's name and address, all of it recorded in ledgers that he stored in his home office because he trusted his own security more than he trusted the fireproof vaults the city offered. Calloway lived in one of Charleston's finest townhouses on Broad Street, a 3-story brick building with a slate roof and iron fencing, and gardens that required 2 full-time gardeners to maintain. Ezekiel had heard the other shipyard workers talk about the house because Calloway had hired Carson's crew 2 years ago to build custom bookshelves for his library, and the men who had worked that job described the interior in odd tones, the marble floors and crystal chandeliers, and paintings in gold frames. On a Sunday, in late January, Ezekiel walked past Calloway's house for the first time. He did not stop or stare, just walked by at a steady pace like he had business elsewhere. But he took in every detail he could. The house sat on a corner lot with entrances on 2 streets. The windows on the ground floor had iron bars. The front door was heavy oak with brass fixtures. There was a carriage house in back where Calloway kept his horses and vehicle, and servant quarters above it, where his enslaved household staff slept. Ezekiel walked past that house 6 more times over the next month, always on Sundays, always with his legitimate pass from Carson in his pocket. He learned the household's patterns, when the servants came and went, when Calloway himself was home, versus when he was at his auction house or attending to business elsewhere. He learned that Calloway employed a cook, a housekeeper, a stable hand, and a general manservant, all of them enslaved, all of them sleeping in those quarters above the carriage house. He learned that Calloway's wife had died 2 years ago, and his grown children lived in other cities, which meant the household was smaller and less active than it might otherwise be. Each observation added to Ezekiel's mental map of the property and its vulnerabilities. He noted that the servants typically finished their work in the main house around 9 o'clock in the evening, after which they would cross the garden to their quarters and remain there until morning, unless specifically summoned. He observed that Calloway kept late hours in his study, often working on his ledgers by lamplight until nearly midnight, but that when he traveled for business, the house stood dark and quiet, except for the servants' quarters. He noticed that the iron bars on the ground floor windows did not extend to the pantry window on the north side of the house, a detail that struck him as significant, though he was not yet sure why. The planning became its own kind of obsession, something that occupied Ezekiel's mind during the long hours of shipbuilding work. While his hands shaped oak planks and fitted joints, his thoughts were mapping routes through a darkened house, calculating the time it would take to locate the ledgers and destroy them, considering every variable that might mean the difference between success and capture. He thought about fire and how it spread, about which materials burned fastest and which created the most smoke, about how long it would take for flames to attract attention in a neighborhood where houses stood close together, and people were vigilant about the threat of conflagration in a city built largely of wood. February came, and Ezekiel still had no real plan, just the skeleton of an idea and a growing certainty that he would act on it somehow. He needed to know where Miriam was, needed to have that information before he did anything that might make finding her impossible. It was Isaac who finally provided that piece, not deliberately but through a chance conversation with one of the free carpenters whose cousin worked as a stable hand for the same family that had bought a child from the Whitmore sale. The family name was Patterson, and they lived in Columbia on a street called Laurel Hill, in a house with white columns and a circular driveway. They were not particularly cruel as slaveholders went, which meant they did not whip their slaves more than they thought necessary and fed them well enough to keep them working. Miriam was being trained as a lady's maid and seemed to be adapting to her new situation with the resilience of childhood, which meant she cried herself to sleep most nights but smiled during the day when smiling was required. Ezekiel wrote this information in his memory as carefully as if he was carving it into wood. The Patterson family, Laurel Hill Street, Columbia. When the time came, if the time came, he would need that information to find his daughter. For now it was enough to know she was alive and where she was living. March arrived with warmer weather, and the shipyard became a hive of activity as Carson rushed to complete 3 vessels before the summer hurricane season began. Ezekiel worked longer hours than ever, his hands building ships while his mind built something else entirely, a plan that was slowly taking shape like a hull emerging from raw timber. He began to acquire the things he would need. A small knife, pocketed from the carpentry tools when no one was watching, a tinderbox, purchased from a street vendor with a penny he'd been given as a Christmas bonus, a knowledge of which houses on which streets had cisterns that could be used to wet cloth against smoke, which alleys led where, which directions the patrols typically moved through the city after dark. He told no one what he was planning, not even Isaac, who had become something like a friend. The risk of betrayal was too great, and beyond that, Ezekiel wanted to protect others from the consequences of his actions. When he was caught, and he had no illusions that he might not be caught, he wanted to be the only one who suffered for what he had done. April brought Confederate jasmine blooming on fences throughout the city, the air sweet with its scent, and Ezekiel finally saw Ruth again. He had been walking on King Street on a Sunday afternoon when she emerged from Ashford's carrying a wrapped package, a delivery being made to a customer's home. She walked in his direction, and for a moment he thought she might pass by without seeing him. But then her eyes met his, and something flickered in her expression, a flash of recognition quickly suppressed. They could not speak, could not stop and embrace, could not do anything that would draw attention from the white people moving around them on the Sunday streets. But as Ruth passed by Ezekiel, she let the package shift in her arms, and a small scrap of fabric fell to the ground, a deliberate accident that made Ezekiel bend to retrieve it. As he handed it back to her, their fingers touched for half a second, and Ruth whispered two words so quietly he almost missed them. "Stay alive." That was all. 2 words, and then she was moving past him down the street, and Ezekiel stood there with his hand still tingling from that brief contact. Stay alive. It was permission and instruction and plea all wrapped together. A message that said Ruth understood they might never see each other again, but she wanted him to survive anyway, wanted him to keep breathing and working and hoping, even if hope seemed pointless. Ezekiel watched her disappear around a corner, and he knew that he could not stay alive the way Ruth meant, could not simply endure and adapt and make the best of an impossible situation. He would stay alive, but he would do it on his own terms. And if those terms led to his death, then at least it would be a death that meant something. In the days following that encounter, Ezekiel found himself replaying those 2 seconds of contact over and over in his mind, analyzing every detail of Ruth's expression and the pressure of her fingers against his palm. She had looked thinner than he remembered, but not broken, worn down by labor and separation, but not destroyed by it. There had been something in her eyes that suggested she was surviving in the way Isaac had described, making room for the stone of grief without letting it crush everything else. Ezekiel wondered what stories she told herself to get through the days, what private rebellions she enacted in the privacy of her own thoughts, what dreams she still allowed herself to have about a future that seemed more impossible with every passing month. He wondered, too, what she would think if she knew what he was planning, whether she would approve of the risk he was preparing to take, or whether she would beg him to choose safety over vengeance. Part of him wanted to believe she would understand, would recognize that destroying Calloway's ledgers was not just about rage or revenge, but about refusing to let their family's suffering be reduced to neat columns of figures in a businessman's records. But another part of him suspected that Ruth would choose his survival over any symbolic gesture, would rather he live as Carson's property for the rest of his days than die in some futile act of resistance that changed nothing about the fundamental injustice of their situation. May was the month when everything converged. Ezekiel had spent nearly 8 months gathering information and resources and courage, and now the pieces were finally aligning. He learned from a conversation overheard at the fish market that Calloway would be traveling to Savannah on business the 2nd week of May, leaving his house in the care of his household staff for 3 days. He learned from Isaac that the night patrols had been reduced because the city was short on funds and the mayor had cut back on what he considered non-essential services. He learned from his own observations that the servants in Calloway's household typically finished their evening work by 9 o'clock and retreated to their quarters above the carriage house, leaving the main house empty until morning. The plan Ezekiel had been constructing in his mind finally crystallized into something concrete. He would wait until Calloway was in Savannah, until a night when the moon was dark enough to provide cover, but not so dark that moving through streets would be impossible. He would leave the shipyard after the evening meal, using the same route he walked on Sundays, but timing it for after the patrols had passed through that sector. He would enter Calloway's house through the back garden, through a window he had noticed on one of his walks that had a loose latch. He would find the office where the ledgers were kept, and he would destroy them in the most permanent way he knew how. And then, if he survived that night, he would disappear into whatever future might be possible for a fugitive slave who had just committed arson against one of Charleston's most prominent businessmen. The night he chose was May 14th, 1848, a Tuesday when the moon was barely a sliver in the sky and clouds threatened rain that had not yet begun to fall. Ezekiel worked his regular shift at the shipyard, ate his evening rations of rice and beans, and lay in his bunk until the sounds around him settled into the rhythms of sleep. At midnight he rose as quietly as he could, dressed in his darkest clothes, and slipped out of the sleeping quarters through a window he had loosened days before. The walk to Broad Street took 35 minutes, moving through back alleys and cutting across gardens, avoiding the main thoroughfares where patrols might still be active. Ezekiel's heart hammered in his chest, but his hands were steady as he approached Calloway's house from the rear. As he tested the window latch he had scouted and found it still loose enough to manipulate with the blade of his knife. The window swung open with barely a sound, and Ezekiel pulled himself through into what appeared to be a butler's pantry. Shelves lined with crystal and china that gleamed faintly in the darkness. The journey through Charleston streets had been a study in controlled terror. Every shadow potentially concealing a patrol, every distant voice a possible alarm. Ezekiel had moved with the purposeful stride of someone on legitimate business, knowing that hesitation or furtive movement would draw more attention than confident passage. He had passed within 20 feet of a pair of white men standing outside a tavern, their conversation loud with drink and argument, and neither had given him a second glance. He had crossed Meeting Street just as a carriage rattled past, and the driver had not even turned his head to see who walked behind his vehicle. The city at midnight was less vigilant than its daytime self, its attention divided between commerce and pleasure in ways that created gaps through which a careful man might slip. Now, standing in Calloway's pantry with his feet on fine Persian carpet and his breath coming fast in the darkness, Ezekiel felt the full weight of what he was about to do settle onto his shoulders. This was not the abstract planning of the past months, but the concrete reality of breaking and entering, of trespassing in a white man's home with intent to destroy property worth thousands of dollars. If he was caught in this room, there would be no trial, no opportunity to explain or defend himself. Summary justice would be swift and brutal, an example made for any other enslaved person who might contemplate similar violations. But Ezekiel had not come this far to turn back now, had not spent 8 months planning and preparing and gathering courage only to retreat at the moment of execution. He moved deeper into the house, with careful steps, his carpenter's knowledge of how buildings were constructed guiding him through rooms he had never seen. The stairs to the second floor were carpeted, muffling his footfalls, and he climbed them with one hand on the banister and his eyes straining to see in the darkness, broken only by faint moonlight through windows. He stood for a moment listening, making sure the noise of his entry had not alerted anyone, and when no alarm was raised, he moved deeper into the house. He had never been inside this building before, but he had built enough fine homes to understand their typical layouts, where the offices and libraries were usually located. He found what he was looking for on the second floor, a room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large desk, papers stacked neatly on its surface and ledgers filling the shelves behind it. Ezekiel lit a candle from his tinderbox, needing light to make sure he was destroying the right materials, and in that flickering illumination, he saw the records of Nathaniel Calloway's 20-year career in human trafficking. Ledger after ledger, each one bound in leather and filled with handwritten entries documenting sales going back to 1828, names and ages and prices, physical descriptions and notes about temperament, buyer's information and payment terms, thousands of lives reduced to lines of text, carefully maintained and cross-referenced, a bureaucracy of bondage recorded in permanent ink. Ezekiel pulled the ledgers from the shelves and began stacking them in the center of the room. There were 43 of them in total, plus boxes of loose papers containing bills of sale and correspondence with buyers, receipts and contracts and legal documents that formed the infrastructure of Calloway's business. He piled them all together, every scrap of paper that might document ownership or sale, and as he worked, he thought about Ruth standing on the auction platform with her head held high, about Miriam crying as they dragged her away, about the thousands of other people whose lives were recorded in these pages. When the pile was complete, Ezekiel stood over it with his tinderbox in hand, and he hesitated for the first time since entering the house. Once he lit this fire, there would be no going back, no way to undo what he was about to do. He would be a criminal in the eyes of the law, wanted for arson and probably suspected of worse crimes, hunted by every slave catcher and patrol in the region. The smart thing would be to leave now, to climb back out that window and return to his bunk and pretend this night had never happened. But Ezekiel had not come this far to choose the smart thing. He had come to choose the thing that mattered, the gesture that would say he was more than property, that his family was more than inventory to be bought and sold. He struck the flint and touched the flame to the pile of ledgers, watching as fire caught and began to spread across decades of careful record-keeping. The paper burned hot and fast, flames climbing toward the ceiling and filling the room with smoke and light. Ezekiel stood watching for perhaps 20 seconds, making sure the fire had taken hold and would not easily be extinguished. And then he turned and walked out of the office and down the stairs and through the butler's pantry and out the window he had entered by. Behind him, the flames were already spreading to the wooden shelves and the curtains and the rug, the fire feeding on the fuel of Calloway's fine furnishings and growing into an inferno that would be visible for blocks. Ezekiel crossed the garden and climbed over the back fence and landed in an alley that ran behind the row of townhouses on Broad Street. He could already hear shouts from inside the house, servants waking to the smell of smoke, and he began to run, not in panic, but with purpose, moving toward the harbor where he had spent so many Sunday afternoons standing at the water's edge. The streets were dark and mostly empty. A few late-night pedestrians who paid him no attention as he passed. Behind him, the glow of fire was spreading, orange light reflecting off clouds, and he heard the first cries of alarm as people noticed the flames. Charleston had no organized fire brigade, just bucket brigades organized by neighbors when disaster struck. And Ezekiel knew that by the time anyone mounted an effective response, Calloway's house would be beyond saving. He reached the harbor in less than 10 minutes, his lungs burning from exertion and smoke inhalation, and he stood at the waterline where he had stood so many times before. The difference was that this time he was not looking out at the ships wondering where they might take him. This time he was looking back at the city, at the glow of fire spreading across the night sky, at the evidence of what he had just done burning bright enough to be seen from the harbor islands. Ezekiel had no illusions about what would happen next. The fire would be investigated, the loss of Calloway's records would be discovered, and the hunt for whoever had set the blaze would be immediate and intense. His absence from the shipyard would be noticed in the morning, and Carson would report him as a fugitive, and the patrols would begin searching with every resource they could muster. A slave who committed arson against a white man's property could expect no mercy if caught, would likely be hanged as an example to others who might be tempted to similar acts of rebellion. But Ezekiel had not done this expecting to escape the consequences. He had done it because some things mattered more than survival, because the destruction of those ledgers was worth whatever price he would pay. In those burning pages were the documented sales of his wife and daughter, the paper trail that said they belonged to other people. Now that paper was ash, and while it would not free them from bondage, it would at least erase the neat accounting that made their enslavement seem orderly and legal and inevitable. The fog was rolling in from the harbor, thick and damp and concealing, and Ezekiel walked into it as deliberately as he had walked into Calloway's house. He followed the waterline south, away from the busy docks, and toward the marshes, where the city gave way to wilderness. His feet left clear prints in the mud, tracks that any competent tracker would be able to follow when the sun rose. And Ezekiel did not bother trying to hide them because he wanted them to be found, wanted the trail to lead to the water's edge and stop there, wanted people to wonder what had become of the carpenter who had burned down Nathaniel Calloway's house. The water was cold when he waded into it, cold enough to take his breath away and make his muscles clench. But Ezekiel kept walking until the harbor bottom dropped away beneath his feet, and he had to swim. He swam parallel to the shore for perhaps 50 yards. The fog so thick now that he could barely see the lights of the city behind him, and then he turned and swam back to land at a different point where the marsh grass grew thick and tall. He crawled out of the water, shivering and exhausted, his clothes heavy with salt water, and he pushed into the marsh grass until he found a depression in the ground where he could curl up and try to preserve what warmth remained in his body. Dawn was still hours away, and he needed to rest, needed to gather his strength for whatever came next, because while the fire might have destroyed Calloway's records, it had not solved any of the fundamental problems that kept Ezekiel separated from his family. He lay in the marsh grass and listened to the sounds of the city in the distance, shouts and cries, and the chaos of people trying to contain a fire that was already beyond containment. He thought about Ruth, who would hear about the fire and would somehow know that he had set it, because who else would have such specific motivation to destroy an auctioneer's records? He thought about Miriam in Columbia, too far away to hear about Charleston's troubles, but growing up in a household that would tell her nothing about her parents, or where she came from, or why her family had been torn apart. The physical sensations of lying in cold marsh grass, his body still shaking from the swim through harbor water, competed with the mental images that would not stop replaying in his mind. He kept seeing the moment when fire had caught on those ledgers, the way the flame had spread from page to page, like judgment finally being rendered on 2 decades of human trafficking, documented in meticulous handwriting. He kept remembering the weight of those leather-bound volumes as he'd stacked them, had felt the physical heft of all those recorded lives and sales and separations. 43 ledgers, each one representing hundreds of transactions, thousands of people whose humanity had been reduced to entries in a balance sheet. Ezekiel had always possessed a strong visual memory, a trait that made him good at carpentry because he could look at a piece of wood and see the finished product hidden inside it. Now that same gift tormented him with perfect recall of details he wished he could forget. He could see Miriam's face as they dragged her to the auction platform, could remember the exact pattern of sunlight on the floor of the holding pen, could recall the sound of the auctioneer's gavel coming down to mark the sale of his daughter for $290. These memories were burned into him as permanently as the brand that marked some enslaved people. Wounds that would never fully heal, no matter how many years passed or how far he ran. But alongside those painful memories was something else now. Something new that Ezekiel was still learning how to hold. He had struck back. He had not accepted his powerlessness, but had instead found the one action available to him and had taken it with full knowledge of the consequences. The system of slavery was built on countless small violences and indignities that accumulated over lifetimes, on the daily reinforcement of the idea that enslaved people were property without agency or will or the right to resist. Ezekiel had shattered that illusion, at least for himself, had proven that even the most powerless person could still choose to act, could still find a way to disrupt the machinery that ground humans into profit. The marsh around him was alive with small sounds, frogs calling and insects chirping, and the rustle of small animals moving through vegetation. Ezekiel had spent his whole life being told where to go and what to do, his movements controlled by other people's decisions and desires. Now he lay in this marsh of his own choosing, a fugitive with no certain future, but at least with the freedom to decide his next move for himself. That freedom was fragile and temporary, might end with his capture or death in a matter of days. But it was real, in a way that nothing in his previous 32 years had been real. The sky began to lighten toward dawn, and Ezekiel knew he could not stay where he was. The search would begin in earnest when the sun rose, and this marsh was too close to the city to provide real safety. He needed to move inland, needed to put distance between himself and Charleston, needed to find whatever underground network might exist to help fugitives make their way north toward freedom. But before he moved, before he began that journey, Ezekiel allowed himself one moment to savor what he had accomplished. Somewhere in the ruins of Calloway's townhouse, buried under collapsed timbers and melted brass fixtures, were the ashes of 43 ledgers that had documented 2 decades of human sales. Those records could never be reconstructed, the information lost forever. And while Calloway would surely try to rebuild his business from memory and whatever duplicate records might exist elsewhere, there would be gaps and uncertainties, and families who might slip through those gaps into something that resembled freedom. It was not the rescue he had dreamed of when they first separated his family on that auction block 8 months ago. It was not reunion or justice or any kind of fairy tale ending, but it was resistance, it was refusal. It was a gesture that said Ezekiel had not accepted the role assigned to him by a system that treated humans as property. In destroying those ledgers, he had destroyed a piece of the machinery that kept that system running smoothly, had thrown sand in the gears and caused disruption that would ripple outward in ways he might never know. The sun rose fully, and Ezekiel began to move, crawling through marsh grass toward higher ground, putting distance between himself and the waterline where his footprints ended. He had no plan beyond survival, no clear destination beyond away from here, no resources except his carpenter's skills and his literacy, and his absolute refusal to be captured alive. The odds against him were enormous, and he knew it. Knew that most fugitives were caught within days of their escape, knew that the penalties for what he had done would be swift and brutal. But Ezekiel also knew something that Nathaniel Calloway and Carson and all the other men who had profited from his labor would never understand. He knew that there were things worth dying for, worth risking everything for, worth destroying your own future for if it meant striking a blow against the machine that ground people into profit margins and ledger entries. The fire he had set would burn itself out by midday, but the act of setting it would echo forward in time, would be whispered about in quarters and kitchens, would become part of the stories people told to remind themselves that resistance was possible even when it seemed futile. Days later, when the patrols finally gave up searching the marshes and the harbor, and declared the fugitive carpenter probably drowned, when the whispered stories began to circulate about the slave who had burned the auctioneer's house with every ledger inside, when Ruth heard the tale and held it close to her heart like a terrible gift, the legend of Ezekiel of Charleston had already begun to take shape. Some said he made it north to freedom. Others said he died in the marsh from exposure and exhaustion. Still others claimed they had seen him in cities across the South, working under different names and helping other fugitives find their way to safety. The truth was simpler and more complicated than any of those stories. Ezekiel survived that night in the marsh and the days that followed. He moved through the low country using skills learned from 12 years of forced labor, skills that taught him how to read the land and find food and shelter and avoid the places where white people congregated. He made his way slowly north, following the North Star and the moss on trees and the guidance of people who helped fugitives, even though the penalties for such help were severe. It took him 4 months to reach Pennsylvania. 4 months of traveling by night and hiding by day, of near captures and close calls, and moments when he thought he could not take another step. He crossed into free territory on a September morning, exactly 1 year after he had watched his wife and daughter sold on a Charleston auction block, and he stood on free soil for the first time in his life, and wept tears that contained every emotion he had been holding back for 32 years. He found work in Philadelphia as a carpenter, using skills that had once enriched a slaveholder to support himself as a free man. He changed his name to Freeman Wright, a choice that made other fugitives smile with recognition. He saved every penny he could, putting aside money toward a goal that seemed impossible, but that he worked toward anyway, with the same patient determination that had characterized his escape. 2 years after arriving in Philadelphia, Freeman Wright had saved enough money to hire a conductor on the Underground Railroad to go south and bring back specific cargo. It took 6 months and 3 attempts, and more money than Freeman had ever imagined possessing. But in the spring of 1851, a wagon arrived at his boarding house carrying a woman and a 10-year-old girl who had been extracted from bondage through a combination of forged papers, bribes, and careful timing. Ruth looked older than Freeman remembered, her hair showing gray that had not been there 3 years ago, and Miriam had grown tall and solemn in the intervening years. They stood in the street outside his boarding house, and for a long moment no one moved, the 3 of them frozen by the sheer impossibility of being together again. Then Miriam said the word she had not been allowed to say for 3 years. said it softly like she was afraid it might not be real. And she said, "Daddy," and that single word broke whatever dam had been holding them apart. They rebuilt their family in Philadelphia, slowly and imperfectly, carrying scars that would never fully heal, but choosing to build a future anyway. Freeman worked as a carpenter, and Ruth took in sewing, and Miriam went to school for the first time in her life, learning to read and write in a classroom where she was a student rather than property. They had more children over the years. 3 sons who grew up hearing the story of how their father had burned down the auctioneer's house, how their mother had survived 3 years of separation without losing hope, how their sister had been rescued from bondage by an underground network of people who believed freedom was worth the risk. The story of what happened in Charleston that May night in 1848 became part of the oral history of the abolitionist movement, told and retold with variations and embellishments, until it was hard to separate fact from legend. Some versions claimed Ezekiel had burned down 3 buildings. Others said he had freed a dozen slaves during his escape. Still others insisted he had returned to Charleston multiple times to help other families escape. Freeman never confirmed or denied these stories, understanding that sometimes the legend mattered more than the reality, that people needed heroes, even if those heroes were just ordinary men who had reached a breaking point and acted. Nathaniel Calloway rebuilt his business after the fire, working from memory and duplicate records held by other auction houses, but his operation never fully recovered from the loss of those 43 ledgers. Families who had been separated used the confusion to claim they had been sold together, to insist their children belonged to them rather than to other buyers, and in some cases these claims went unchallenged because there was no paperwork to prove otherwise. It was a small disruption in a massive system, barely a ripple in the ocean of slavery that would not end until the Civil War forced its conclusion, but for the specific families who benefited from those gaps in the records, it meant everything. Freeman Wright lived to see the Emancipation Proclamation signed in 1863, lived to see the war end, and the 13th Amendment passed, and the beginning of a reconstruction that would prove more complicated and painful than anyone anticipated. He lived to see his children grow and have children of their own, to see his daughter Miriam become a teacher, and his sons become skilled tradesmen who owned their own shops. He lived to be 71 years old, and when he died in 1887, he was buried in a cemetery in Philadelphia under his chosen name, with his wife and children and grandchildren standing beside the grave. The decades Freeman spent in Philadelphia were marked by the ordinary struggles and joys of any working family trying to build a life in a growing city. He joined a Methodist church, where he and Ruth became active members, their voices joining the choir on Sunday mornings, and their hands helping to build the small school the congregation established for black children. He worked 6 days a week in his carpentry shop, building everything from simple furniture to elaborate architectural details for the row houses that were spreading across the city's expanding neighborhoods. He saved money carefully, putting aside small amounts each week until he could afford to buy the building where his shop operated, making himself a property owner in ways that would have been impossible in the South. But the scars of slavery never fully faded, and Freeman carried them in ways both visible and invisible for the rest of his life. He could not tolerate being in enclosed spaces for too long, a legacy of the holding pens and slave ships and locked quarters of his bondage years. He would wake sometimes in the night from dreams of auction blocks and separation, would reach for Ruth in the darkness to confirm she was still there beside him. He was fiercely protective of his children's education, insisting they attend school even when money was tight, even when their labor might have helped supplement the family income. Because he understood that literacy and learning were forms of freedom that could never be taken away once acquired. His relationship with Miriam was particularly complex, shaped by the 3 years they had been separated and the guilt Freeman carried about not being able to protect her during that time. Miriam had her own scars from those years, memories she shared sparingly even with her parents, and there was a wariness between father and daughter that slowly healed over time, but never completely disappeared. Yet it was Miriam who became the family's keeper of stories, who insisted on remembering and recording what had happened to them, who understood that their survival and reunion was exceptional and needed to be preserved for future generations who would not otherwise believe such things were possible. At his funeral, Miriam told the story one more time, the story of the night her father had walked into fire and smoke to destroy the records that said their family could be bought and sold. She told it the way she remembered him telling it, without embellishment or heroic flourishes, just the simple facts of what one man had done when pushed beyond the limits of what he could endure. She told it so her children and her children's children would understand where they came from, what it had cost to bring them into a world where they could grow up free. And somewhere in that story, in the telling and the listening and the remembering, was everything that mattered about resistance and survival, and the human capacity to choose dignity over safety, to choose action over acceptance, to choose to burn down the machinery of oppression even when the cost was everything you had. The fire Ezekiel had set in Charleston had long since burned out, but the story of that fire continued to burn in the hearts of everyone who heard it, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is destroy the records that claim to define who you are and what you're worth, and walk away from the ashes into whatever future you can build with your own 2 hands.